Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
Good evening and welcome to everyone who is watching us live tonight or listening back to this on their podcast. We've got a very special show ahead. Myself and Khan Duke are going to be interviewing Bruce about his fantastic new book, Power Up Your Questioning. How are you today, Khan?
Khan Duke is perfect. It's all good.
All good. That's what we like to hear.
Yeah.
Now, Bruce has got one of his latest books, Power Up Your Questioning. It's a practical research-informed guide that explores how to transform classroom questioning from a routine to powerful, drawing on all his experience in cognitive science, pedagogy, and classroom experience. He challenges educators to move beyond that superficial questioning habits and embrace some more impactful strategies. And so this book is grounded in that belief that questioning is central to student thinking, engagement, and learning. And so we're going to explore some of the viewpoints, some of the thoughts, some of the habits, and some of those tips and techniques that he has gone through and share. So we're not just assigning questions at probe thinking and not just memory. We're really exploring those. We're listening deeply to the students' answers, adapting, extending their learning, and developing those habits. So welcome back to the show once again, Bruce. How are you this evening?
Great to be with you, James, with Khan Duke. Thank you very much for inviting me on. I'm very well, thank you. Busy.
Brilliant. Excellent. I know last time we spoke, it was about a year ago, wasn't it? And you were at the time ahead and you were working up in Scotland, and how your job has changed over the last year or so. So can you just give us a little bit, before we get into the questions and go through it all, a little bit of your journey for our listeners and where it's come through and how you got to your books and those purposes. And then we'll explore a little bit more about Power Up Your Questioning.
Yeah, sure. So I trained as a chemistry teacher in Edinburgh back in 2002. So I've been working in education just a little over 20 years now. In 2012, I was appointed Deputy Head of Teaching and Learning in a rural state school, secondary school in the southeast of Scotland. I was the Deputy Head Teacher there for 6 or 7 years. And in August 2020, I was appointed the Head Teacher of Berwickshire High School, which is another rural state secondary school also in the Scottish borders. I've been the Head Teacher really since then. But at the moment, since August last year, I'm on a career break to focus on working with teachers and school leaders across the United Kingdom, internationally as well. In my spare time, I write books. The Teaching Delusion trilogy, Power Up Your Pedagogy, the Illustrated Handbook of Teaching, nicely displayed, James, and the latest one, Power Up Your Questioning, which just came out in February with a really nice foreword by Dylan Williams. So I'm busy. I'd had quite a lot of schools getting in touch with me and asking if I would do some work with teachers and with school leaders there. I was doing that really in my spare time, and what I've done is this year committed to that 100%. So I'm on the road a lot.
Cool. So we're really, really happy to have you here with us to talk about this new book, like you said, that's just come up. But just a shout out, this show, everyone, is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational. That's the publisher of Bruce's book. They're publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today. There's the code there. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles, and the code, there it is, coming across the screen again, JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. They have a huge range of titles, so you won't be disappointed. But let's get cracking here. So the book, Power Up Your Questioning. First of all, Bruce, my question comes from my experience as an English language teacher, and I actually just did classroom questions with my students last week. So I've got a piece of information here that I read, and I waffle it to my students all the time. As much as 80% of the exchanges in the ELT classroom include questions. So that's what I read from a different author. questions are central to classroom life is another thing I've read. Tell us, please, or explain in more detail, why is questioning so important to classroom life?
So if we look at the science of learning, if we look at educational research about what is most likely to be the most effective at particular times, and we home in on the difference between novices, someone who, regardless of age and stage, doesn't know or understand an awful lot about a particular topic, say, and the way that novices learn. Well, research is clear that the most effective, the most efficient way to teach anyone who's a novice in a particular area, it's through a direct teaching approach, something which is teacher-led, but not the most effective and efficient way to teach anyone who's a novice. Teacher-led, yes, but very, very interactive, lots of questioning and lots of discussion. As expertise starts to develop, as schemas start to form in long-term memory, then research would suggest that actually less teacher input, more student-led pedagogy, that will typically be more effective and efficient at that stage in the learning sequence. But bulk of the time that we're working with young people, something that is quite teacher-led will typically be the most effective way to teach something. But I'm always at pains to say, when I'm working with teachers in schools, we don't, by teacher-led pedagogy, mean lecturing. We don't mean the teacher just talking all of the time. The most effective teaching is very, very interactive. Our teaching is infused with frequent questioning. So that's really what the book is about: asking more questions, asking better questions, developing techniques so that we get more students to think about each of the questions we ask.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And what you're saying about, that teacher-led isn't necessarily, frontal teaching or that lecture style, or just here's the information, traditional. I don't know if you have it in mainstream subjects, but in English language teaching, we have, different lesson plan models. And the one that I introduced into my pre-service teachers today was the PPP, the present, practice, and produce. And the present is, they immediately, the first thing they thought of was, right, I present the grammar, I present the, the past simple. And they see it as me writing on the board, me showing them and saying, this is what it is now, let's have some controlled practice. So we're moving from frontal teaching, which is maybe something that was common, that was, the methodology used back in the day, right? Back from grammar translation method from Latin schools and things like that. But you're saying that questions in the classroom doesn't necessarily mean that we're moving away from teacher-led. Is that, did I understand?
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah. I'm suggesting that for anyone, regardless of age and stage, this could be somebody in junior school or in senior school, this could be adults. For anyone who's a relative novice, a teacher-led approach is the most likely to be the most effective and most efficient way to teach them. As expertise develops, then ease off on the teacher-led pedagogy and allow students to lead their learning more. But yeah, very much as you're describing, strong communication is, of course, incredibly important. But we shouldn't be talking for extended periods of time without providing opportunities for students to think, because thinking is the key to learning. Again, if we go into cognitive science, educational research, we see that message over and over and over. The oft repeated Daniel Willingham quote from Why Don't Students Like School? Memory is the residue of thought. The great teaching toolkit. Learning is most likely to happen when students think hard. We see it over and over and over again in the literature. So the book, Power Up Your Questioning, kicks off with an acronym STAR, which is trying to summarize four of the most important reasons why we ask students questions in the classroom. So the S stands for spotlight, because what students have stored in their long-term memory, what they are thinking about in their working memory, it's hidden. But when we ask questions effectively, that's bringing it to the surface, it's making it visible, it's shining a spotlight on the things that they know, understand, including misconceptions that they have. The R, that stands for responding. So great teaching is responsive. We're making decisions all the time about what to do or not do. And at their best, these decisions are based on evidence of what students understand, what they are learning. The A stands for attention, because with the best will in the world, our attention will wander, no matter how well the teacher is presenting, no matter how strong the communication is. Human nature dictates that even if we are very interested in that, often our attention will wander. But when we ask a question, we tend to grab attention back again. So that's the A. And then the T in the STAR acronym, that's thinking. Thinking is the key to learning. So those are 4 of the most important reasons why we need to ask questions all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, those elements in the acronym, they really resonate with me. In my classes, I know that I've had, a handful of times in every 90-minute class where I ask a question to get the students back in because their attention wanders, right? So and I noticed that they've drifted. So I ask them a question and then they acknowledge that their attention has drifted. And because I work with post 18, because I work with post 18 young people, I can then say to them, yeah, stay with it. I know you've wandered off. That's why I've asked you a question, right? What you mentioned about thinking, and I did read this as well in this other book on classroom management, where the author said, so he described what teachers do a lot, and I'd like to hear your take on this. So he says, right, teachers will ask a question in the class, to the class, and you'll have, as usual, maybe 3 hands shoot up real quick. The teacher picks those students. So he says it's a cycle then. Teacher asks the questions, students who know the answer put up their hands, teacher picks those students, students give the correct answer, teacher says, well done, pat on the back, and yay. And he says that, so his advice, and what I've been telling my pre-service teachers is, that's called you're chasing after the right answers. And for those students, the learning has happened, but we have to ask ourselves, what about the students who've not volunteered or who've not raised their hands, as quickly to answer? We want to find, out, has the learning happened for them? Do you see this a lot, or in your experience, would you say that this is really as common as what I read? Teachers are always chasing the right answers.
Yes, you described it very well. It's a common pitfall. So in the book, Power Up Your Questioning, I highlight various common pitfalls. So the traps that we all can fall into from time to time, but hopefully by highlighting them, we make it less likely that we will fall into these. So one of them is we choose the first or the second student who puts up their hand to answer. And the book offers different trusted techniques that teachers can build into their repertoire to try to avoid that pitfall, using the answer from 1 or 2 students as a proxy for the learning of everyone in the room. Again, that links to what you've just described. So some techniques that can help with that, well, one of them, pause. So you ask a question and you pause, you wait, and you say nothing. And if you contrast that with asking a student straight away, well, the pause provides more thinking time. It becomes more likely that more students are thinking about the question that you've asked. And you can teach students to do that. You can explain to them, when I ask a question, I will usually pause. And the reason that I'm pausing is because I want everybody to think about it. Maybe you give a steer. You say, you ask the question and then you say 10 seconds, think about that, everyone. A different technique, patient hands. So you resist the temptation to choose the first, the second, the third student who puts up their hand to answer. They're keen, and it can be very tempting to choose them quickly because you want to reward that keenness, or maybe you have one eye on the clock. But better to say something like, that's great, I've got 2 or 3 hands, I'd like to see some more hands, please. I can see lots of hands in this side of the room. Come on, I'd like to see some more hands. I'd like everybody thinking about the question. So you're giving that steer that you want everyone to think about it. A couple of more techniques. One is cold call, which comes from Doug Lemoff's Teach Like a Champion. The idea that you ask a question, you pause, and then you choose a student, any student, to answer. They might have their hand up, they might not have their hand up. You're not doing it to be mean. You're not doing it to cause anxiety or to embarrass the student. You're doing it because you want every student thinking about pretty much every question you ask. And if nobody knows who's going to be chosen, well, it's more likely that more students will be thinking about it. And one more technique, last one, show me boards. Show me boards are a teacher's best friend. So maybe we call them mini whiteboards.
Okay.
But the idea with those is you ask the question and then students write or draw a response on the board. It's not just one student doing that, it's the entire class. It gives everybody thinking time. It makes everybody commit to a specific answer. The teacher is now getting formative information about the thinking or the learning from everyone in the room, and that's incredibly valuable.
I like that. I might try. I might try that. I really do struggle sometimes to get all my students, to participate or to get some kind of feedback that the learning has happened for them, or even, that there's interest in what they're, what's happening in class. I'm familiar, and I do one of the strategies that you mentioned, where I don't call the first three that put up their hands. I wait. And like I said, because my students are older, I can say to them, in jest, yes, I know, just wait. Let's see, can we get a few more answers? I like what you mentioned also about, explicitly giving them that thinking time. So I could imagine a teacher asking a question and saying, let's count to 10 in our heads, or I'll count to 10. And,
Yes.
At 10, everybody who's got something to say or got something to contribute to this, put up your hands. So,
Yes.
Because students, and, especially when they're in teen angst, right? When they see, already in their insecurities, and the teacher asks a question, and you've got the usual two suspects put up their hands to ask, they'll immediately think, well, that train's come and gone for me. I'm not, I'm out of this. Okay, so you've actually jumped quite far ahead into the book now. Before we look in more detail at the themes in the book, just very briefly, how would you define, if I see, I have my classroom management class tomorrow, so I want to talk to them about questions. How would you define a powerful question in today's classroom?
So in the book, I talk about desirable thinking. I talk about the fact that not all questions are created equal. Yes, in theory, whenever you ask a question, it should encourage thinking, but not all thinking is created equal, because some of it is just too easy. It's superficial. It's hardly worth doing. So I give some examples of that. For example, a lesson plenary to a 12-year-old class. They've been learning about the greenhouse effect. The teacher says, to check understanding, true or false, we've been learning about the blue house effect. It's a throwaway question. That's how I classify it. It's a common pitfall. We can all fall into it. We ask questions that are just too easy. They're barely worth asking. So I give different examples of throwaway questions. Throwaway questions can also be questions that are just far too difficult. They're far too challenging for students. They have no realistic chance of success. And that's very, very demotivating. If questions are too easy, that quickly becomes boring. If questions are too difficult, well, there's no experience of success. And the number one motivator for anyone in any walk of life, it is the experience of success. So we want to give our students that. So the formula that I suggest we try to keep in our minds as much as we can when asking questions: a degree of cognitive struggle plus a realistic chance of success. Get that right, and you're probably producing desirable thinking, which I think is what a powerful question would produce: desirable thinking.
Hi, secondary school teachers. We're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded program helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering math circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
And in your book, you talked about, especially you said about the star, and then you talked about the different themes, so about asking more questions, asking better questions, so you can get that desirable thinking, and getting students to think about each question before they learning from each other and making time you check that. And you've talked about what powerful questioning is there, but what do you think is the foundational principle of questioning? So how can we ask questions effectively, and what is the purpose of questioning? Because until we get that foundation right, and very much you did that in Power Up Your Pedagogy, you started with the cognitive science and how we learn, and through all of that, what makes it questioning that you think is almost the epitome of the classroom, and we get this right, actually this could be the knock-on consequence for everything?
So the book Power Up Your Questioning begins with a section, 20 principles that all teachers and school leaders need to know about learning and how it happens. So it kicks off with the model of learning, the relationship between working memory and long-term memory, emphasizing the importance of thinking. It is true, well, we need to define learning first of all. Learning is the development of long-term memory. We develop long-term memory when we get transfer from working memory into that compartment, into long-term memory. It's true that sometimes when we or our students see something or hear something, it does actually get learned. There is a development of long-term memory. But in most cases, that's not the way that learning happens. In most cases, learning doesn't happen by diffusion, that process where substances move naturally from high to low concentration. Usually there needs to be more than students just seeing something or just hearing something. Almost always, they need to think about it. And not just once. There's a Graham Nussel rule of 3 that I talk about in Power Up Your Pedagogy and Power Up Your Questioning. The idea that for most of what we want students to learn at school, typically they need to think about it on at least 3 separate occasions. So we don't just present it to them. We don't just let them see it or hear it on 3 separate occasions. They need to think about it on 3 separate occasions. And that's what questions can help students to do. And one of the techniques I talk about in the book, it's called different angles. So you've got some specific content, but you design a set of questions that get students to think about that content in slightly different ways. So for example, you might have been teaching them about the water cycle. And maybe as a task, you get them to label a blank version of the cycle. They're thinking about that once in a particular way, but then a bit of time passes. Maybe it's the lesson plenary. Maybe what you ask them to do is to draw the complete cycle from memory. Maybe a bit more time passes. It's the start of the next lesson 2 days later. Maybe you say, explain the water cycle to a partner from memory. Or maybe you ask them a set of true or false questions about the water cycle. Maybe that's in the lesson, maybe that's in homework. Maybe they get a new version of the cycle that's got some deliberate mistakes. Spot the deliberate mistakes, identify why they're mistakes, that sort of idea. So you're getting students to think about the same content in different ways at spaced intervals. That's a good bet to achieve the learning that you're aiming for.
And that's really good because that's got the foundation. But one of the things I love about your book, and I wish more authors did it, is you've got a thing about 10 recommendation steps to get the most from this book. And you talk about that element, but then you go into almost those common pitfalls as well, because it's that idea of when we do that direct instruction is what it is, but what it is also, and that comes back to that rule of 3 you were talking about even with questioning, but what it's not. And I wonder whether, I know we've explored some of those pitfalls already, and talk about the first and second hand and using one or two children just as a proxy. You think, actually, I've got an idea of what the whole class is, but that's not necessarily true. But what I want to think about and ask you is, do you think some of those frequent missteps teachers make when posing questions, do you think it changes us from novice teachers or to expert teachers? And how do we get them then to see that we should spend more time and more focus on this element of questioning? Because I'm just thinking back to my own initial teacher training. I don't think we spent enough time or time at all about asking good questions, which is what the epitome of this is.
Yeah. So the book, I mean, it's a great point, James. The book asks the question near the beginning, how good is your questioning? Typically, give it a 1 to 10. So you can do that as the reader. You can think about your questioning practice. Nobody knows it better than you. So give it a score out of 10. So let's say it's 6 or 7, which is actually probably where most readers will go. When I work with teachers in professional development training, that's typically where most teachers will go, 6, 7. But then I'll ask them to consider why they gave themselves the score that they did. And the book encourages teachers to think about that too. So usually it's one or more of 3 reasons. It's about how many questions we're asking and how often. So the quantity and the frequency. So maybe a teacher is thinking, actually, my teaching would be even better than it is already if I ask more questions or more questions more often. Or maybe it's not that. Maybe you think to yourself, I do ask lots of questions. I'm asking questions all the time. But if I'm being honest, I don't think all of my questions are good questions. So it's about the questioning quality. It's homing in on those themes of desirable thinking, trying to avoid throwaway questions. There's a whole section in the book about that. Or maybe it's neither of those two. Maybe you think to yourself, I ask lots of questions, I'm asking them all the time. I think that typically the questions I ask are really good. They're promoting desirable thinking. But actually, it's the technique. It's the fact that only some of the students in my class, I believe, are thinking about the questions. So I need to develop the technique that I'm using to get more students to think about each of the questions that I'm asking. So the book really is exploring those 3 themes.
And I think that's a really good way of almost disseminating it and boxing it up into the number, quantity, the quantity and the frequency, the quality, and then also the technique. Because you can just throw questions out there within a class, and you often see novice teachers do this, but you're only getting 1 or 2 to really do that. Or you're getting the opposite of educators trying to ask questions where the child is trying to guess what's in their head. So how can we avoid falling into that trap of guess what's in my head kind of questions? And what are some of those trusted techniques that you may suggest?
If that's a pitfall that you feel as a teacher you're falling into, well, it's relating to that second theme, really, isn't it? It's the quality of the question that you're asking. So there's a whole section in the book about that. Really, it becomes about spending some time in advance of lessons, pre-planning some good questions, some desirable thinking questions. You don't necessarily have to work on your own to do that. You could pick a particular aspect of content, and you could start to brainstorm good, desirable thinking questions with a colleague. That can be an excellent professional development exercise. So one of the techniques that the book talks about is spotlight assessment activities. So that's where you're carefully curating questions in advance of lessons to promote desirable thinking and to tease out misconceptions that students are likely to have about particular content. So it's things like true or false, deliberate mistakes, odd one out, multiple choice questions, but with really strong distractors, not throwaway distractors that can be dismissed out of hand with almost no thought. Distractors that actually encourage students to pause and consider whether or not they might actually be the correct answer. And that's where a multiple choice question, well designed, can be so powerful, because yes, a question could just be asked as free recall, and there's value in that, of course there is. But sometimes if we put in distractors that are plausible, it can make a student stop and think, well, hang on, I did think it was this, but now that option's been put to me, I need to think a bit harder about that, because it could actually be that. So taking some time to pre-plan questions in advance of lessons, that can be a good way to avoid poor questions, which is basically, as you suggest, James, guess the answer in my head.
And can I just interrupt here? Sorry, the conversation is really exciting. What that actually reminds me, when you're talking about the quality of the questions, it actually also reminds me of the action verbs from Bloom's taxonomy, isn't it? Because you want to go beyond the just recall, the memory, but kind of synthesizing the information. The example you gave with the water cycle, where in the third time, with the questioning, is you present, say, the text again, but with mistakes. So it's not just pure recall of facts, but actually looking at it and saying, hang on a minute, that's not how I learned it.
Yes.
Right? So identifying flaws, you're moving towards the other end of Bloom's taxonomy. And that, I think, for me, is what changes the quality of a question. And I do wonder, I did read that bit where you said, teachers were asked to kind of reflect on their questioning strategies and, think about how good, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good their questions were, whether teachers actually question what define good, isn't it? I mean, it's something like, well, what, how would I define a good question? So that's also something gets you not just thinking in general about, I asked 20 questions in a space of 30 minutes, but rather, I asked that many, but what's good?
I do talk about Bloom's taxonomy in the book.
Yeah.
With a note of caution associated with it. I actually suggest that for me, I find it more helpful to think of surface level knowledge versus deeper understanding. And with a good question or a good questioning sequence, we're finding out about that surface knowledge, and then we're starting to drill down into the deeper understanding that sits beneath that. So a technique that can help us with that is called drill down, discussed in the book. So you ask a question, maybe you've shown students, say, a diagram of a triangle, and you ask the question, what type of triangle is this? That's surface knowledge, I would suggest. The student says it's equilateral, and that's correct. And many teachers would accept that correct answer and move on, using it as a proxy for what the student actually understands. But if you follow the question up using the drill down technique and you say, why do you think that? Well, the student might tell you, because it doesn't have any right angles. So now you've just found something else out, deeper, about their deeper understanding. They have given you the correct answer. They've got their surface knowledge there, but they gave you it for the wrong reason. Maybe they just guessed, or maybe they had a misconception, which actually allowed them to get the correct answer on this occasion, but in future it would likely lead to problems. So considering surface knowledge against deeper understanding, I think that can be quite useful. And the reason I have a note of caution with Bloom's taxonomy is sometimes because teachers will be criticized by people who observe a lesson, say they're told, well, there wasn't enough higher order thinking. Now, that's different, I believe, from deep understanding. Higher order thinking and deep understanding, they're not quite the same thing. So when we talk about higher order thinking, it's like creativity and evaluation, etc., the upper regions of Bloom's taxonomy. Now, we do want students to get to that point. Absolutely, we do. But that's not going to happen in a single lesson. That's going to happen over a period of time. And it may well be that you're observing a lesson, and actually what is being developed are the lower regions of the Bloom's pyramid, say. The knowledge, the understanding, there are some opportunities to apply the learning. Now, that's not to say that we can't get students thinking hard. We can. We can ask questions that get them to recall knowledge that we want them to learn, to make connections with things that they already know and new information. We can still get them to think hard, but we're still working in the lower region of Bloom's taxonomy. We haven't got anywhere near the analysis and the evaluation and the creativity. So that's a very quick summary of it, but I do go into that in some more detail in the book.
Yeah, I do like that. And then I'll hand over to James. I like that. And you're right in saying, that an observer who comes in gets only a snippet of a lesson, like you say. I have it in English language teaching, right? If the students are introduced to a particular verb tense first, or adjectives, you're still first going to work with surface level knowledge. So yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of it that way, so I'll definitely bring that back to my students. Back to you, James. Sorry to barge in on that.
And this is the whole point, isn't it? When you start asking questions, it will spark different things. And one of the things we're talking with lots of trainee teachers and teachers have been coaching recently is, and you talk about this desirable thinking at this deeper level, and you explain the Goldilocks principle within your book, where you want that cognitive struggle and that realistic chance of success. But often when you coach and support teachers, they always come back with the idea of how can we support those reluctant or quieter students? How can we have students so it's inclusive for all, and that they feel that you as a teacher, you can hear from every student, but actually they're feeling supported within that. And what are some of the techniques and things you've explored? And feel free to explain the Goldilocks principle in a little bit more detail if you want as well.
No, you've done that well, James. It's just another way of framing what we'd said. Not too easy and not too difficult. If it's too easy, it's boring. If it's too difficult, it's demotivating. There's no experience of success. Well, counter to the criticisms that some people throw at cold call, used warmly in an encouraging way, well, cold call can be an incredibly inclusive pedagogy. You can differentiate using cold call. So you can ask a particular student a particular question because you know that student well, you know there is a realistic chance of success. So maybe it's a more straightforward question you targeted at them. And when they get it right, that experience of success is motivating to them. When I talk to students in classes about teachers who use cold call, so many of them say to me, so long as the teacher is using it in a warm way, like we've just said, they say, I really like it when my teacher does that, because I actually wouldn't have put my hand up to answer. I wouldn't have volunteered to answer. I wouldn't have contributed to the lesson unless the teacher had effectively invited me in. So used warmly, cold call can be very inclusive. Chat to a partner can be very inclusive. That's one of the techniques talked about in the book, particularly useful when a question is more challenging. Rather than just go straight to a particular student, you say 20 seconds, chat to a partner. 1 minute, chat to a partner, something like this. It depends on the complexity of the question. Now, students have had the opportunity to refine their thinking, helps build their confidence. When you're asking for a student to volunteer an answer, or now if you're using cold call, they feel more comfortable because they've had the opportunity to talk to somebody else about it. And no longer is it just their answer, it's the answer of the pair. Show me boards, one of the most inclusive pedagogies that there is. Everybody's thinking, everybody's contributing. Some of the students who are the most shy, they feel quite comfortable writing something or drawing something. We can link the use of show me boards to things like multiple choice questions. So if we're worried about literacy in the classroom and how much students can actually write, then we can link it to A and B and C and D. And one more related technique is confidence measures. So you teach students that whenever they write a response on a show me board, they also, let's say top right, put a number, 1, 2, or 3. 1 means it's a guess. 2 means I'm fairly sure, but I'm not certain. And 3 means I'm certain. If you're able to indicate using the number 1 that you're guessing, makes it far more likely that students are actually willing to contribute. Because as much as we say, and we're right to say this, that we want to create the conditions where it's okay to make mistakes, that is the sort of culture we want. With the best will in the world, humans by their nature, they don't seem to like to make mistakes. When I work with adults, if I ask teachers to write something on a show me board, sometimes you can see the fear of getting it wrong. So if that's how adults are feeling, it's very likely that students are feeling like that too. So confidence measures can help students be more willing to participate.
And I'd like to go back on that point you said about we said inclusive and getting pupils. If you use a technique in a warm manner, actually you can get all pupils to really share. And those I've recently been, we do something called teacher research groups, and we got someone school improvement teachers class, and it's not their class, And every single time that we've done this and we observe it, we talk about it, we dissect it, we look at the questioning techniques and things like this, there's always a pupil in there that the class teacher said they would normally be quiet. And it's whether it is talk to your partner, tell your partner, whether it's a cold call, there's no opting out, there's a really warmth in there and a sense of achievement, and is amazing throughout the whole process. And I think often you hear a technique, let's say cold calling, but we don't go to that deeper level of why are we doing it? What's the purpose of it? How can I use it? And how can I use it in a warming manner? And I think that's part of one of the key things we need to get our mindset around, isn't it? Is actually how can we ask deeper questions, but how can we ask them in a purpose that is inclusive for everyone?
That's right. And it comes back to something that was said earlier, I think, by you, James, which is that all of the decisions that we make in the classroom about what to do or not do, they should be grounded in these pedagogical principles, the key messages from cognitive science and educational research. They help us to really understand why we're going to use a particular technique or not. And I don't really believe in saying to teachers, you must always do this, you must never do that when it comes to techniques. Rather, I believe in empowering teachers to make their own good decisions. So with something like cold call, as a school leader, I wouldn't be saying everybody's now got to use cold call. Rather, I'd be saying, well, what we would reasonably expect is that we're using a variety of techniques to help all students to think about every question that we're asking. If a teacher feels that cold call is helping them to do that, then they should. But if for one reason or another, a teacher would rather use a different technique, which is achieving the same aim, which is to get all students thinking about the content that we want them to learn, then that's good. That's okay. A good example, actually, of what I once saw when a teacher didn't really understand the underpinning principles behind a technique, it was exit tickets. So the lesson was coming to a close, the teacher asks a question, and every student writes a response on a piece of paper, and the teacher collects these pieces of paper in and they have a look at them. And the idea is that it helps them to gauge understanding or short-term learning, and that helps to inform what they do or not do in the next lesson. But in this lesson that I saw, the teacher really didn't understand the rationale behind exit tickets. So they asked the question, every pupil wrote it on the piece of paper, and then all the pupils walked out the classroom door with the piece of paper. And then, you talk to the teacher about that, and it's like, well, why did you do that? Like, what was the point of getting them to do an exit ticket if you didn't collect them in? And they said, I didn't realize that was the point. I just thought I was meant to do exit tickets. So that can happen when teachers don't have a clear understanding about the rationale that underpins a technique.
And I just want to say a big thank you to John Catt, who have made this show possible. It's brought in partnership with John Catt Education, publishers of professional development books. Bruce Robertson's book, Power Up Your Questioning, can be available on johncattbookshop.com, and it is on the home screen there for you to use. If you use the code JCTTR2425, that's JCTTR2425, you can have 20% off your order. The only problem I have is I don't have enough book space at the moment, so I need to have a look at solving that. But one of the things that you just alluded to it a little bit there, Bruce, was what are some of the signals that questioning strategy isn't working in the classroom? And you said about a teacher may not understand the underlying principles and the pedagogy behind it, but what are some of those things that when you go in and see a teacher, or you go and even talk to a teacher sometimes that conversation is quite elusive and opening up, what are some of those pitfalls? I know you've written about pitfalls, but what are some of those things you've seen when having those conversations and coaching with teachers?
I think probably the most common pitfalls are teachers talk for extended periods of time without asking a question, or they are asking the first or the second pupil who puts up their hand to answer. They allow shouting out. So I'm going to break my own rule here. I said I don't typically believe in saying to teachers, you must always do this, you must never do that. One exception to that is with shouting out. I don't think shouting out should ever be allowed in a classroom, because if you ask a question and you allow shouting out, you deprive every other student of having the opportunity to think about that question, and thinking is the key to learning. So you're actually affecting their learning negatively. So you have to teach students how to behave in a particular lesson. You have to, in all of your lessons, you need to teach them that shouting out is never okay. But I often do see that. And often teachers are doing it because, again, like I said earlier, they want to just reward the enthusiasm, or maybe they've got one eye on the clock and they think, well, that's good, I got a correct answer. Yeah, that phrase that was used before, Kwan Duk, about chasing the correct answer.
Yep,
Yeah, I
that's
like
right.
that. That's
Yeah.
great. I might use that in a future book. I'll give you full
Okay,
credit.
cool.
Nice. Yeah, that's a common pitfall.
Yeah. And I'd like to just pick up from there now. So let's look at the teachers rather than the questions. We've looked a lot at the questions and the practice, things we can do in the classroom, but let's look at teachers. And I'm really, really interested here because coming from my perspective, and like I said, I'm working with young people who are training to become school teachers in German public schools. And they all come into teacher training as an apprentice of observation. I read that as well, right? Lorty says, people who go into the teaching profession, unlike other professions, they know so much, but from being students, right? We're unlike lawyers, firemen, policemen, we've not spent time being at the end of a fire and being put out. But as students, we see what our teachers do, and we go into the profession sometimes having picked up habits from our teachers. So these young people and novice teachers will go into the classroom with a particular mindset about questioning. So how can their mindset or experience expand or limit the impact of their questioning and their, questioning practices and strategies?
Going back to our model of learning and how it happens, the link between working memory and long-term memory, the principle that thinking is the key to learning. So if you aren't asking very many questions, you need to accept that the chances of pupils thinking about the things that you are presenting, they're quite low. The learning has become quite passive. So you could be explaining things really clearly. The quality of your oratory, the presentations that you're using, really, really high, and that's important. But we have to accept that unless we're pushing students to think, it's unlikely that all students will be thinking. Maybe a small number are thinking, but that's not what we're after. We're not after the learning of a small number. We're interested in the learning of absolutely everyone. So we need to be asking questions all the time. And as a rule of thumb, typically what I suggest in the book is, for every minute of teacher exposition, try to ask at least one question. So if you're thinking back over your lesson and you had been presenting for, say, 20 minutes, if you asked at least 20 questions within that time period, that's probably about the right ratio. If it was fewer than that, then probably your teaching would be even better than it is already if you asked more. And that's not to say that you need to be asking 20 completely different questions or that you need to have pre-planned 20 questions. It's getting back into the follow-up question techniques like drill down. So why do you think that? Would you like to say a little bit more about that? Or maybe a more collaborative follow-up technique, bounce. So you go to another student. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What do you think about what he or she just said? Something like that. That technique is encouraging more students to think about every question that you're asking, and that's what you're trying to do. So yeah, I think the point that you made is a very important one, and it's often missed that much of what new teachers will do in the classroom is informed by their own experience as a student at school and the teachers who they had, the best teachers and maybe some of the poorer teachers too. They think, oh, well, I wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And that can be useful for sure, but it's probably not enough. It's that grounding in the messages that we've been discussing from cognitive science and educational research. And when I work with teachers in schools, I often quote a teacher within my own school, a PE teacher, who what he said to me recently was, I used to believe that my teaching was good enough, but I now can't believe some of the things that I used to do or not to. I can't believe some of those things. And this teacher, I would say, is one of the best teachers in the school and has been teaching for about 30 years, very, very experienced. His exam results are very good too, but didn't really have any understanding about cognitive science, working memory, long-term memory, the relationship between those two things. As is the case, I would suggest, across the whole profession, because, and I'm not criticizing him or anybody else for that, he'd never really been pushed to think about what learning is, how it happens. It hadn't been a part of teacher training. But he started to engage in professional reading. Some of the texts that we've been talking about in this show, Daniel Williams, Why Don't Students Like School, for example, it's a game changer. It's a light bulb moment. Suddenly, he and others understand why some of the things that they're doing are working so well. And actually, we should be doing more of those things or refining them. Suddenly, you work out why certain things aren't working so well, because what they're not doing, say, is getting all students to think about the things that you want them to learn. So professional reading is an absolute game changer. And we keep coming back to this model of learning how it happens, working memory, long-term memory. That's fundamental.
Hi, secondary school teachers. We're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded program helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering maths circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Yeah. What you said about the teacher, what you described about the teacher, I mean, that for me it shows two things. It shows a reflective practitioner, right? Because somebody who's been teaching 30 years, and I've encountered teachers like that who go through school life day in, day out. They do the same thing, chasing. And this is what I tell my students. I say it's very, very easy to just be chasing the right answers, because you ask the questions, you have the usual suspects put up their hand, they give you an answer that's correct, you praise them, you pat yourself on the back, and you say, well, learning has happened, I've done a good job. But you have to reflect. You have to ask yourself, well, not just, the good things like, yeah, I've got, 3 answers, and always these kids in the front. But you have to also be able to ask yourself, well, what about those who've not contributed? Am I neglecting them? Because you're there for the many, you're not there for the one, and you're there for them, and you're not there for yourself and to show, go home and say, oh, I did a good job today because, I asked questions and people could answer it. And that to be able to reflect on that, and to be able to recognize that. So these are things, I mean, learning has changed, even if, for many people, we trained back at a different time altogether. There were different strategies. We knew different things about learning and teaching, and the generation that we're working with now, they're different, and cultures are different. I went to school in Southeast Asia, and you had to pay attention, and it was all frontal teaching, right? But now when I see my kids, they, and my pre-service teachers have asked me as well, how do I keep the attention of these young children? They're so easily distracted with all the stuff on social media. They have an attention span of a fish, well, maybe more than a fish, but right. So our strategies need to change. So, but coming back then, you've described over the course of the last 50 minutes or so different things that we can do. Show me boards. You see, I've just written show me boards. I'm going to order show me boards now. Exit tickets, you talked about, the bounce technique. Coming back again to the teacher and habits, what habits would you recommend? What habits can teachers, should teachers build to become better questioners themselves? I mean, I think it's not something, I read this book and I know now how to ask questions. I don't pretend to know how to ask good questions 100% of the time. I think change is a habit, and becoming better is, a work in progress. So what's your advice? What are, some habits that teachers should cultivate?
Think about your own questioning on a 1 to 10 scale.
Mm-hmm.
Try to home in on the specific aspect that you think would really benefit from some focus, whether that be the quantity and the frequency, the quality, or the technique. Once you've identified that, pick one, maybe two techniques from the book, Power Up Your Questioning, and really focus on practicing those in a deliberate way so that they become second nature to you. You can draw on that technique as and when you've become something of an expert with that technique. What the book does is it gives an outline of the technique. It explains why you would use the technique, so the teacher's got that solid rationale. It gives some suggested steps. You don't have to follow those regimentally, but it's a suggested steer. And then there are some accompanying notes that just give a little bit more detail. James was touching on the idea that at the beginning of the book, it sort of maps out a 10-step sequential approach to get the most of it. But you're absolutely right. It's about habit forming. And we're not going to get better at any technique unless we spend quite a bit of time really practicing it in a deliberate way. And one of the professional development activities that the book touches on is the idea of peer coaching. And let's say you've picked a technique and you've studied that in the book and you're practicing it day after day after day. That's good. But a very valuable thing that you could do to help your professional development more is to invite a colleague in, somebody who you know and trust, somebody who you get on well with, somebody whose opinion you respect. They don't need to observe much of the lesson. They don't need to sit for the for the duration of it. They just need to home in on a particular point in the lesson when you're using the technique. And they can probably give you some pointers and some steers and some suggestions. They can probably see some things that with the best will in the world, you can't see, because it's such a complex job and you're having to think about so much at one time, but just an extra pair of eyes. Another way, of course, that you could do it is to set up a camera in the room and to film yourself. Not everybody feels comfortable with that. Some teachers do, some teachers don't. But you're not going to be able to get into the conversation just through that process necessarily. It's often better to get a colleague in. So that can be very helpful.
Yeah, I really like that. I like what you say about, and I'll rephrase it, to set goals. That's what I tell my students as well. I mean, I tell my pre-service teachers, I teach them a lot of things, a lot of strategies, but ultimately, and it's similar to what you're saying, it's like every classroom is different, every lesson, right? Every cohort of kids is different. And then whether you're teaching, say, biology or math or ESL, EFL in my case, you're going to have to see what your audience is like. And I always tell them at the end of every session, we have a 90-minute session once a week, ask yourself, what's your takeaway from today? And make it, your goal for the next week. That's the one thing. And then I had something else that I wanted to ask, but I've just, that was so good. I've been distracted.
Well, just building on the idea of goals, because that's a great point. When I work with teachers, I was working with teachers in a school in Scotland today, I talk about the importance of what I call pedagogy development plans. And at the start of every term, something really simple and straightforward, it's not too onerous. It's got 4 different parts to it. Every teacher identifies a specific aspect of their teaching practice that they want to focus on developing. So let's say questioning, specifically to encourage more students to think, or all students to think about every question asked. That's the overarching goal. That's the target.
Yeah, I like that. James, write that down in our notes. Pedagogy development plan. That's really cool. I think because especially for mentors in schools, when they're working with novice teachers, and we're doing this whole thing about reflective practice, it's been around for a long time, reflective practice, right? But it is still an art to reflect and come out, with good outcomes. So I think I like the idea of that pedagogy development plan, because then you can set your goal for the term.
Sorry to interrupt, but sitting beneath the aim, then you pick 1 or 2 techniques, let's say show me boards, let's say cold call, and next to that, you identify the specific features that you really want to focus on. So perhaps say a teacher says cold call, question, then name. They want to focus on that rather than name and then question. The idea being that if you ask a name, everybody else switches off because they think, well, this question's directed at that student. And then maybe the teacher says 10 times per lesson. So that's what they're aiming for. That's what they've chosen. They want each lesson to use cold call at least 10 times. Then if you're observing the lesson, you can help the teacher with that. You can help them to count, and you can maybe suggest points in the lesson when actually they could have used cold call a little bit more or something along those lines. So these are some of the aspects that you would include in a pedagogy development plan.
Cool. James, over to you.
There's so much to think about and think.
I've
got a couple of questions here, but I just want to do a big shout out because there's some lovely feedback that we're getting from our listeners at in the background. So I know Samir, she's working on questioning at the moment and finding it very, very helpful. I think I really like this from Julie as well. Be kind to yourself. You're a learner of your craft. Learn, try, reflect with a trusted colleague. I think that's really, really important. And the fact that we just got to get that 1% better every day. And it's this deliberate practice. And I think this is the whole, you think about questioning at the end of the day, we're trying to interact with pupils and we can't necessarily see what they're thinking or the depth of understanding, and deliberately focus on this with purpose and understand what it is, but what it's not, is really important. And one of the questions I've written down, and I think I kind of can anticipate what you're going to say, Bruce, so I wonder. But how do you think this differs in different settings? So primary, secondary, AP, and also different domains. Like, would these principles and techniques work in music as they would in art or PE or English and things like that? And what are your thoughts behind that?
Yes, 100%. Across all subjects and across all ages and stages of learning, 100%. I work almost as much with primary teachers as I do with secondary teachers. The principles of asking frequent questions, asking desirable thinking questions, and using techniques to encourage all pupils to think, they are absolutely sound and they absolutely apply. What you expect from younger students, say, on show me boards, well, it's not going to be the same necessarily as what you expect from more senior students. But the principles, they absolutely apply, and you just adapt the techniques to fit your own context.
Fantastic. And before I ask you our final question, Bruce, I just want to say another big thank you to John Catt Publishing. The show wouldn't be possible without them. And it's at johncattbookshop.com. You can go and visit and I really recommend go and get him Bruce's book. I've got his Power Pedagogy here, and I've had the honor of reading his Powerful Questioning as well. And they are fantastic. There we are. Look, it's like we're professionals at this or something. And if you use the code JCTTR2425, that's JCTTR2425, you can get 20% off. My final question is a question I ask all the time. And at the end of what has been a really rich conversation for the last 60 minutes or so, what's that one, apart from buying your book? You can't have that. Okay, that's the only thing. So I suggest that anyway. What's that one small yet powerful shift a teacher can make tomorrow in the classroom? Or if you're like me, next week because I'm still on Easter break.
Show me boards. If a teacher isn't using show me boards,
100. I thought that I had that in my head. Show me boards.
Yeah, definitely. And if logistics is a problem, then get into the habit of getting the first class of the day. Let's say you're secondary and you've got multiple subjects. First class of the day takes them out, and then they stay on desks the whole day. Last class of the day puts them away. And then you've not got this issue of taking them out, putting them away and all of that. Or if it's primary, of course, the same principle applies, that students take them out, pupils take them out at the start of the day, and then they stay on desks the whole day, and then they go away at the end. So show me boards are an absolute game changer. They get all students to think, they give students time to think, they make them commit to a specific answer, they make that thinking and learning visible to you. So use show me boards more.
Brilliant. And please go out and buy Bruce's book, Power Up Your Questioning, from John Catt Bookshop. So thank you, Bruce, for what has been a fantastic conversation. And thank you, Candu, my colleague at Teachers Talk Radio. Remember, you can listen back to this on your favourite podcast player, Apple Podcast, Spotify. We're all over them. And go back through and have a look at some of our other shows that we've had with John Catt and others through the time. I had Sap Grushaw a few months ago about just how his book about powerful explanation and explicit teaching, and we've got loads of fantastic shows coming up. But once again, thank you both, and have a lovely rest of your holiday. If you're like me, still on your Easter, I'm going to rub it in, or if not, good luck when you get back to your work. Thank you and goodbye.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.